Hello and welcome to our tutorial on index match. In a previous tutorial we looked at VLOOKUP, and VLOOKUP has a little bit of a restriction in that it only looks to items in the leftmost column of a table. So it looks for ID numbers in the leftmost column of a table. One of the problems with that is sometimes your ID numbers, for whatever reason, may not be in the leftmost column. They may be in another part of that lookup table. So in an instance like that, we use a combination of two functions, one called match and one called index. Index match together will generally give you the ability to look kind of all over the place in order to find ID numbers and pair them up with another piece of information that will be used, or that you'll pull from one sheet to another. So think of it as a much more flexible lookup set of functions. So we have kind of a similar example to another tutorial, except it's a little bit flipped around. In this case, invoice is up here in the front, and our inventory here is on a totally separate sheet. Now, as you can see, the ID numbers in this case are not on the left-hand side. They're over on the right. And what we actually want is we have the ID numbers here, but we want to bring back the actual name of the product into this column. And it's usually easiest if we kind of build the two functions one at a time. So we'll start by creating the match function. So I click here in the cell where I want the information to appear. I click Formulas. I go to Insert Function, and in this case, rather than going and searching for it, it's already here in this list, so I'll click on Match and I will click OK. So here is our function wizard, and it's going to guide us through putting this match function together. So the lookup value is going to be over here, kind of like what we did in the VLOOKUP. So I will click there on the ID number of 104 in the invoice. The lookup array, in this case, rather than going and naming a table, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click where it says the lookup array, and it says the lookup array is a contiguous range of cells containing possible lookup values, an array of values, or a reference to an array. Again, that seems really complicated, but let's show you what it is. I'm going to go and click on this button over here. I'll go over to the inventory. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and highlight the ID numbers in this table. And then I'll go and click on this button one more time. And it's put in the lookup array, which is the column in this case that includes the ID numbers. I'm going to click down here and give it a match type of 0, and then you'll note that it tells me the number 4. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Well, that's still not the product description, but what it's actually telling me is that the ID number 104 is actually in the 4th row of this table. It's not counting the header row, so it tells me it's in the 4th row. If I come back here and I click on the invoice one more time, and I just use the fill handle to pull down, now we have a little bit of trouble here because I'm getting all of these error messages. And if I click on one of these cells and click the little error message beside it, or just let it float over top of this little yellow sign, it says the formula in this cell refers to a range that has additional numbers adjacent to it. Okay, if I click down here and I roll over this little warning, a value is not available to match the formula or function. So just to show you what's going wrong here, in this case, this works perfectly well. It's reporting back the correct information. And you'll see it's pulling it from the range of C2 to C5. Again, I'm just going to click at the end of this function and I'm going to tap my Enter key. And if I go to my inventory, I see C2 all the way down to C5. That makes sense. But if I go back to the invoice and I click, let's say, on one of these little NAs, I see that it's looking now at C5 to C8. So as this function was pulled down the column, it changed the references here. So it's actually looking at empty cells, and we don't want it to do that. So we have to make sure there's a way that this match function never loses focus of C2 to C5 so that these addresses don't change. Right now, these addresses are what we call relative, meaning as the function gets copied down the cells, the references change. As mentioned earlier, we want to lock them, make sure that they don't. And the way we lock them is we make them absolute. And the way we make them absolute is we add a $sign in front of the C, a $sign in front of the 2, and we do the same thing with this next address as well. Oops. We put a $sign in here, and we also put a $sign in here. Once again, this locks those addresses, so no matter where this function goes, it doesn't lose sight of C2 to C5 on the inventory sheet. I'm going to tap my Enter key. It won't make a big difference here, but now if I click here and I drag down, it's actually reporting back the right rows that these numbers are in. So that's all well and fine. It's reporting back the rows that these ID numbers are in, but we need a way for it to report back the actual product name. That is where the index comes in. So almost think of these as page numbers. And if you look at an index in the back of the book, you have the page numbers, but the page numbers are also associated with the topics. And that's what an index does. It associates topics with page numbers. So in this case, it's going to do kind of the same thing. It's going to associate the product name with the ID number. And to do that, we need to come back here. We'll click on the number 4. And what we'll do is we'll nest this match function inside of an index function. So I'll click between the equal sign and match. I'll type in index, since that is the function. I'm going to go ahead and put in a opening parenthesis. And it kind of gives me an idea of how I'm supposed to phrase this. So I'm going to go and put it in, I have to put in the reference to the product names in here. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and I'm going to click on the inventory sheet. That'll put in the reference to inventory. And then I will go ahead and I will highlight the product names. And to separate this index and the match functions, I'm just going to drop in a comma. And I will run into the same problem I ran into here if I don't make these absolute. So as I did before, I'm going to put in some $signs. And by doing so, I'm going to make these references absolute. I'm also going to take a look here in that I want to make sure that, again, my number of opening parentheses and closing parentheses are the same. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to tap my Enter key and add another parentheses in here. Pardon me, I'll do that and then I'll tap the Enter key. So I've got 2 opening parentheses, 2 closing ones. When I tap my Enter key, I'll be taken back to the table or the invoice, and you'll see that it's now reporting back the name of printer. So if I go, click here, and use my fill handle, I will find that it reports back the names of the products. And you'll see 101 is the computer, 102 is the keyboard, 103 is the mouse. And you'll see that that data is correct down the column. I could, of course, come in here and I could create another index match to bring across the brands, but I'll leave that for you to play around with. The main idea is this. The match reports the row that the data is kept in, the position of that row, whether it's first, second, third, or fourth. But then the index comes in and it actually reports, well, if the ID number's in the fourth row, the index is what tells it what the product name is. So it essentially associates the ID number and the position of it with the corresponding piece of data that I want to bring over to the invoice sheet. Now, compared to a VLOOKUP, an index match is, I think, a little more complicated, but it is more flexible. So again, feel free to review this tutorial and take a look at the index match handout that is on the Blackboard site as well. It will take you step by step through the process.